Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Air France Flight 4590 crash. Close your eyes and let the sounds of the modern world fall away, replaced by the soft, shimmering heat of a summer afternoon in northern France. It is July 25th, 2000. We are standing within the glass walls of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, a place where the air is thick with the scent of jet fuel and the quiet, rhythmic humming of a world in motion. The sun is high, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete, and the light reflects off the silver surfaces of the machines that wait patiently on the tarmac. It is a day that feels heavy with the promise of something extraordinary, a day where time itself seems to move a little slower, as if honoring the legend we are about to witness. The terminal is a symphony of soft echoes, the rolling of suitcase wheels over polished stone, the low murmur of multilingual conversations, and the distant chime of flight announcements. But amidst the standard bustle of an international airport, there is a specific pocket of quiet elegance. Near a designated gate, a group of travelers has gathered. These are the 100 passengers of Flight 4590. Most of them are German tourists, a community of friends and families who have come together for a journey of a lifetime. They are bound for New York City, where the majestic cruise ship, the Deutschland, awaits them for a 16-day voyage to South America. There is a palpable sense of joy among them, a shared excitement that is softened by the refined atmosphere of the Concorde lounge. They sip champagne from delicate flutes, the bubbles rising slowly in the golden light, unaware that they are part of the final chapters of a fading era. Outside, resting like a great predatory bird, is the aircraft itself. This is the Concorde, registration Foxtrot Bravo Tango Sierra Charlie. To look at it is to see the pinnacle of 20th century ambition. It is not like the other planes. It is slender, almost fragile in its beauty, with a needle-like nose and sweeping delta wings that look like they were carved from a single piece of white marble. Its skin is painted a brilliant, reflective white, a color chosen specifically to radiate the intense heat it generates when flying at twice the speed of sound. At rest, it appears almost alien, a silver ghost from a future that arrived early. The ground crew moves around it with a quiet reverence, their figures dwarfed by the 4 massive Rolls-Royce Olympus engines tucked beneath the wings. These engines are cold now, but within them lies the power to cross the Atlantic in just under 3.5 hours, a feat that still feels like magic even after 24 years of service. Inside the cockpit, Captain Christian Marty, a man with over 13,000 hours of flight experience, begins his final preparations. He is joined by his first officer, Jean Marcotte, and the flight engineer, Gilles Jardinaud. Their movements are a practiced dance of switches and dials, a routine they have performed hundreds of times. The air in the cockpit is cool, smelling faintly of electronics and old leather. They review the weight of the aircraft, the 95 tons of fuel required for the journey, the luggage of the 100 guests, and the weight of the silver bird itself. Everything must be perfect. The Concorde is a sensitive creature. It demands precision. As they work, the sun continues to bake the runway outside, creating a shimmering haze that makes the horizon ripple. It is a peaceful scene, the kind of afternoon where one might believe that nothing could ever go wrong with such a magnificent machine. The boarding call eventually comes, a soft invitation to leave the solid ground behind. The passengers stand, gathering their hand luggage, and move toward the jet bridge. As they step inside the Concorde, they find a cabin that is surprisingly intimate. It is narrow, with soft gray leather seats and windows no larger than a human hand. It feels less like a commercial airliner and more like an exclusive club, a private vessel designed to whisk the elite through the thin, dark air at the edge of space. They settle into their seats, the 100 travelers and the 9 dedicated crew members, clicking their seatbelts into place with a series of metallic snaps that echo in the quiet cabin. The doors are pulled shut, the heavy seals locking with a pressurized hiss that separates them from the outside world. For those on board, the terminal at Charles de Gaulle is already a memory. Their focus is forward, toward the Atlantic, toward the skyline of Manhattan, and toward the dream of the supersonic flight. Now the silver bird begins to stir. The ground tug vibrates as it connects to the nose gear, slowly pushing the aircraft backward away from the gate. From the terminal windows, onlookers stop to watch. The Concorde is always a spectacle, a sight that never fails to draw a crowd. We see it gliding across the asphalt, its long, elegant shadow trailing behind it like a dark twin. It moves toward runway 26 right, its 4 engines beginning to whine as they are brought to life. There is a low, guttural growl that vibrates through the earth, a sound that can be felt in the chest of anyone standing nearby. The aircraft is now a living thing, breathing in the warm summer air, its systems humming with the energy of nearly 100 tons of fuel. It reaches the end of the taxiway and turns, lining its long, pointed nose up with the center of the runway. The path ahead is 3 kilometers of gray concrete, stretching out toward the green fields of Gonesse. The silver bird is at rest for the very last time, poised on the brink of the sky, waiting for the command to fly. The ground tug finally disconnects, leaving the Concorde standing alone on the vast apron of the airport. In the cockpit, the 3 men begin the precise choreography of the startup. One by one, the 4 Rolls-Royce Snecma Olympus engines wake from their slumber. The sequence is rhythmic and practiced. First, engine number 3 begins its ascent into a roar, followed closely by engine number 2. Then the power spreads to the outer wings as engines 4 and 1 ignite. There is a specific scent that fills the air, a mixture of treated air and the faint, sweet tang of kerosene, the perfume of aviation. The cockpit, a dense forest of analog dials and switches painted in a soothing shade of teal, glows in the late afternoon light of July 25, 2000. The delay of nearly 1 hour, caused by the replacement of a thrust reverser motor, is now a memory. The silver bird is alive, its heart beating with the power of 4 mighty turbojets. With the engines stabilized, the crew moves through their post-start checklists. Each word spoken is measured and calm, a testament to decades of experience. Captain Christian Marty reaches for the lever that controls the Concorde's most famous feature, its nose. With a soft, hydraulic groan, the pointed tip of the aircraft begins to droop. For taxiing, it is lowered 5 degrees, shifting the silhouette of the plane from a sleek arrow to something more watchful, more terrestrial. Through the cockpit windows, the expansive concrete of Charles de Gaulle Airport opens up before them. The sun, hanging at 4 o'clock in the sky, casts long, dramatic shadows across the tarmac. There is a sense of immense weight beneath them. The aircraft is heavy, carrying 95 tons of fuel in its complex network of 13 tanks. This fuel is not just for the journey across the Atlantic. It is the lifeblood that balances the plane's center of gravity as it pierces the sound barrier. Every ton is accounted for, every kilogram essential for the flight to New York. As the brakes are released, the Concorde begins its slow, stately crawl toward the runway. It does not move like a standard jet. There is a certain grace to its gait, even on the ground. The nose gear, positioned far behind the cockpit, makes the pilots feel as though they are suspended out over the taxiway, floating above the ground. They steer the white giant onto Taxiway Romeo, a long stretch of gray that leads to the western edge of the airport. The vibration of the tires on the concrete seams is a rhythmic thud-thud, thud-thud, a heartbeat for the journey. To the passengers in the 100 seats behind the cockpit, the view out of the small, thick windows is one of shimmering heat. Many of them are on their way to a luxury cruise, their spirits high, unaware that they are participating in the final chapter of a legend. The air dancing above the engines of other planes creates a distorted, dreamlike landscape as they glide past the silver lines of more common aircraft. The taxi route is several kilometers long, giving the crew time to settle into the rhythm of the afternoon. Flight engineer Gilles Jardinaud monitors the fuel flow with a watchful eye. The taxiing process alone consumes a staggering amount of energy. By the time they reach the runway, they will have burned 800 kilograms of fuel. The conversation in the cockpit remains focused on the takeoff parameters. They discuss the speeds required for rotation and the contingency plans for any eventuality. The weather is clear, the winds are light, and the atmosphere is one of professional routine. Yet just 5 minutes ahead of them, the stage for tragedy has already been set. On runway 26 right, a small strip of titanium, no longer than a person's forearm, lies resting on the center line. It had fallen from a Continental Airlines DC-10 as it departed for Newark. It is a tiny, jagged piece of metal, nearly invisible against the vast expanse of the runway, waiting in the summer heat for the Concorde to find it. As Air France Flight 4590 reaches the holding point of the runway, the world seems to settle into a deep, expectant silence. The pilots can see the shimmering length of the asphalt stretching out for 4 kilometers, a long gray ribbon that disappears into the haze of the horizon. They are cleared to line up and wait. The captain eases the throttles forward just enough to turn the great bird onto the center line. The nose is perfectly aligned with the white paint of the runway, a needle aimed at the sky. In this moment, the Concorde is a study in stillness and potential energy. The 4 engines hum at a low idle, a restrained growl that hints at the nearly 40,000 pounds of thrust each one is capable of producing. The crew performs their final checks. Is everyone ready? The captain asks. Yes, the first officer replies. Yes, says the flight engineer. It is 4:42 in the afternoon. The cabin is secure, the passengers are buckled into their seats, and the final taxi is complete. The silver bird is ready to run. The silence of the holding point is finally shattered by the rhythmic awakening of the 4 mighty Olympus engines. There is a deep, resonant hum that vibrates through the very floor of the cabin, a sound that feels more like a heavy heartbeat than a machine. As the throttles are pushed forward, the Concorde begins its slow, deliberate roll onto the center line of runway 26 right. Imagine the friction of the heavy rubber against the sun-warmed tarmac. The 100 passengers, tucked away in their slim leather seats, feel the first gentle push of acceleration, a force that gradually pins them back as the aircraft gathers momentum. The world outside the narrow, thick windows begins to blur, a mosaic of gray concrete and green grass streaking past at ever-increasing speeds. To those inside, it feels like the beginning of another routine journey to the edge of space, a familiar transition from the earth to the sky. The speed climbs steadily now, 100 knots, then 150. The air rushes over the sharp delta wings with a mounting hiss, a sound like a distant ocean storm. Everything seems normal, a practiced choreography of physics and engineering perfected over decades. But lying in wait, just ahead on the vast expanse of the runway, is a small, jagged piece of titanium. It is less than 18 inches long, a mere sliver of metal left behind by a departing aircraft only 5 minutes before. In the shimmering heat haze of the July afternoon, it is invisible to the pilots, a silent predator waiting for the heavy weight of the Concorde to pass over it. At this speed, the runway is no longer just a path. It is a high-velocity stage where the smallest imperfection can become a catalyst for disaster. Then comes the moment of collision. It is not a loud bang, but a sudden, violent shudder that ripples through the entire airframe. As the front right tire on the left main landing gear strikes the metal strip at over 180 miles per hour, the reinforced rubber disintegrates with terrifying force. A large fragment, weighing nearly 10 pounds, is hurled upward like a projectile. It strikes the underside of the left wing with the power of an explosion. Inside the cabin, the passengers feel a sharp jolt, a momentary disruption of the smooth ascent. In the cockpit, the instruments begin to flicker as the first signs of trouble emerge from the mechanical heart of the great bird. The pilots, focused on their airspeed, feel the plane begin to tug stubbornly to the left, resisting their control as if it is suddenly tethered to the ground. The impact of the rubber fragment creates a massive pressure wave within fuel tank number 5. It does not puncture the metal from the outside. Instead, the shock causes the tank to rupture from within, tearing a hole in the aluminum skin through sheer hydrodynamic force. Aviation fuel begins to pour out in a thick, heavy mist, gushing into the turbulent wake of the engines at a rate of several gallons every second. And then, the air itself seems to ignite. A spark, perhaps from a severed wire in the landing gear bay or the searing heat of the engine exhaust, finds the fuel vapor. In an instant, a plume of bright orange flame erupts, trailing behind the left wing like a phoenix's tail. It is a terrifying sight to the witnesses on the ground. A supersonic icon, wreathed in a banner of fire nearly 100 feet long, struggling to break free from the earth. The heat is intense, melting the delicate metal of the wing's inner elevon. As the fire rages, engines 1 and 2 begin to choke. They ingest the hot gases and debris, causing them to surge and lose power. The deep roar of the engines becomes uneven, a staggering rhythm that mirrors the pilot's mounting desperation. The flight engineer calls out the failure of Engine 2, his voice calm, but strained against the cacophony of alarms filling the small cockpit. They have reached V1, the speed of no return. There is no longer enough runway to stop this burning giant. They are committed to the air, forced to fly a wounded machine that is losing its fight against gravity before it has even left the tarmac. The captain pulls back on the yoke, a final, heavy command to rise. The nose of the Concorde lifts, pointing toward the pale blue sky with a grace that belies the chaos beneath its wing. The aircraft leaves the ground at nearly 200 knots, but the climb is labored and shallow. It does not soar. It staggers. The landing gear remains locked in the down position, creating immense drag that fights the remaining thrust of the 2 healthy engines on the right side. From the control tower, the air traffic controller watches in stunned silence as the jet clears the end of the runway, a streak of fire and smoke painting a dark line against the afternoon sun. The shadow of the flames dances across the grass below as the plane clears the airport boundary, heading toward the small town of Gonesse. The struggle has only just begun, a race against time and temperature that no one was ever prepared to run. The wheels have left the tarmac of runway 26 right, but there is no sense of relief in the cockpit. Usually, the moment of liftoff is a transition into the smooth, predictable embrace of the sky. Tonight, however, the air feels heavy and unyielding. Inside the flight deck, the atmosphere has shifted from the intense vibration of the takeoff roll to a terrifying, synthetic clarity. The master warning chime cuts through the roar of the remaining engines, a persistent, rhythmic gong that signals a catastrophic failure. Captain Christian Marty feels the aircraft pull violently to the left, a heavy, sluggish weight that resists his every command. It is not the graceful climb he has practiced thousands of times in the simulator. Behind him, the flight engineer, Gilles Jardinaud, watches the needles on his console flicker and die. Engine number 2 has failed completely, and engine number 1 is gasping, surging as it ingests the hot, toxic gases from the inferno blooming beneath the wing. The fire is no longer just a warning light on a panel. It is a physical presence. A plume of burning kerosene, nearly 100 feet long, trails behind the left wing like a comet's tail. In the tower, the air traffic controller's voice remains steady, but is laced with an unmistakable edge of horror as he radios the crew. Air France 4590, you have flames. You have flames behind you. The words are redundant. The crew can feel the heat radiating through the airframe, and they can hear the symphony of alarms. The fire bell, the ground proximity warning, and the frantic mechanical shouts of the cockpit voice recorder. Captain Marty commands the fire procedure for Engine 2, and Jardinaud reaches for the shutoff, cutting the fuel to a turbine that is already little more than a hollowed-out shell of melting metal. As the jet struggles to reach even 200 feet of altitude, a secondary crisis unfolds beneath the floorboards. First Officer Jean Marcotte reaches for the lever to retract the landing gear, seeking to clean up the aircraft's profile and reduce the drag that is bleeding away their speed. But the lever does not respond as it should. The intense heat from the fire has already ravaged the electrical lines and the hydraulic systems within the wheel well. The massive landing gear remains down, locked in the airflow. For a supersonic needle like the Concorde, these extended wheels are like two massive anchors dragging through the sky. They create a lethal amount of drag, preventing the aircraft from accelerating. The speed hovers precariously around 200 knots, a dangerously low threshold for a machine of this weight and design. The physics of the flight are now working against them with a cruel efficiency. The Concorde's famous delta wing is designed for the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, where it slices through the atmosphere at twice the speed of sound. Here, just above the rooftops of the Parisian suburbs, the air is thick and soupy. To maintain lift at such a low speed, the pilot must pull the nose up higher and higher. This is known as a high angle of attack, but as the nose rises, the drag increases even further. It is a spiral of diminishing returns. The aircraft is fighting for every inch of height, its wings pushing against the air with a desperation that mirrors the three men in the cockpit. They are caught in a pocket of impossible physics, a supersonic bird forced into a slow-motion struggle for survival. Outside the windows, the landscape of Gonesse crawls by at an agonizingly low altitude. Residents look up to see an apocalyptic sight, the pride of French aviation, a white spear of a plane, wreathed in orange fire that flickers against the overcast gray sky. The roar of the two remaining engines on the right side is deafening, a desperate, uneven scream of machinery pushed far beyond its limits. The asymmetric thrust is now terminal. With two engines pushing hard on the right and nearly nothing on the left, the aircraft wants to roll. It wants to flip over and surrender to the earth. Marty fights the yoke, his muscles straining as he pushes the rudder to its limit, trying to hold the wings level against the invisible forces tearing at the airframe. "Watch the airspeed," Marcotte warns. His voice, preserved on the black box, is a haunting testament to professional calm in the face of the abyss. They make a split-second decision to head for Le Bourget Airport, a small airfield only a few miles away. It is their only hope for a survivable crash landing. But the distance might as well be 1,000 miles. Engine number 1, which had been surging and recovering, finally gives up. The intake of fire and debris has destroyed its internal blades. Now, the entire left side of the aircraft is dead weight. The speed drops to 150 knots, 140. The stick shaker begins to vibrate in Marty's hands, the final, tactile warning that the wing has stalled. The air is no longer flowing over the delta. It is breaking away in turbulent, useless eddies. In the final seconds of this 113-second flight, the struggle becomes quiet. The alarms continue to chime, but the pilots have run out of options. "Too late," Marty says, a soft realization caught by the microphone. "No time." The Concorde, once the fastest passenger jet in the world, loses its grip on the sky. The nose pitches up one last time, a final, defiant gesture toward the clouds, before the left wing drops and the horizon begins to spin. The lush green fields and the gray roofs of the Hôtelissimo Gonesse rush upward. The world outside the cockpit tilts vertically as the aircraft stalls, falling backward and sideways. The transition from the sky to the earth is sudden and absolute, ending the brief, agonizing journey of Flight 4590 in a small town that would never forget the day the white bird fell. In the small, sun-drenched commune of Gonesse, the afternoon of July 25th, 2000, was unfolding with the quiet, rhythmic predictability of a midsummer day. The air was thick with the warmth of the French countryside, and the town, situated just a few miles from the bustling runways of Charles de Gaulle, was accustomed to the distant, low-frequency hum of aviation. But on this Tuesday, at precisely 4:44 in the afternoon, that familiar background noise was replaced by something far more visceral. A shadow, immense and flickering with an unnatural orange light, swept across the rooftops. The ground beneath the residence began to vibrate, not with the gentle rumble of a passing jet, but with the violent, shuddering resonance of a machine in its final, desperate throes of life. On the edge of town, at a modest 3-story structure known as the Hotelissimo, life was continuing as it always did. Within those walls, people were resting, working, and planning their evenings, entirely unaware that the sky above was about to fall. The impact was not a singular sound, but a cascading series of explosions that felt like the earth itself was being torn open. As the Concorde, banking heavily to the left and struggling to maintain its place in the air, finally succumbed to gravity, it didn't just crash. It arrived with the force of an elemental disaster. The aircraft, laden with nearly 100 tons of highly flammable jet fuel, slammed into the hotel restaurant. Witnesses from nearby roads described a sight that looked like an atomic bomb, a massive, blinding mushroom cloud of fire that instantly swallowed the white concrete of the building. The sound was a deafening roar that flattened the surrounding silence, followed by a shockwave that shattered windows and sent a rain of soot and charred debris across the fields of Gonesse. In an instant, the hotel, once a place of rest for travelers and a workplace for locals, was transformed into a roaring inferno, hidden behind a curtain of thick, oily black smoke. Inside the hotel, the tragedy found those who had never even looked toward the sky. We often focus on the passengers in the air, but the 4 souls lost on the ground that day represent the profound randomness of such a catastrophe. Among them were 2 young women from Poland, Maria and Paulina, who had come to France to work and build a future. They were inside the building, perhaps preparing for the dinner rush or tending to the afternoon chores, when the ceiling vanished into a sea of fire. There was also an Algerian employee and a guest, individuals whose lives were cut short not by a failure of their own making, but by the trajectory of a machine miles from its intended destination. The destruction was so total that the hotel restaurant was essentially erased from the map, leaving only a blackened skeleton of scorched metal and crumbled stone. The heat was so intense that it warped the nearby trees and melted the asphalt of the road, creating a landscape that looked more like a battlefield than a suburban crossroads. The emergency response was immediate, yet the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Within minutes, the sirens of over 400 firefighters and police officers began to wail across Gonesse, a dissonant chorus that signaled the arrival of help. But as the first responders reached the site, they were met with a wall of heat that pushed them back. The jet fuel, which had spilled across the ruins, created a fire that was nearly impossible to extinguish with conventional means. Firefighters stood as close as they dared, their silhouettes small against the towering flames, as they poured foam and water into the wreckage. The air was filled with the acrid, chemical smell of burning kerosene and the sharp tang of melting plastic. There was a desperate, frantic energy to those first 60 minutes, a hope that someone might have survived in the periphery, balanced against the grim reality of the fireball they were witnessing. As the hours passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the orange glow of the fire started to fade, replaced by the flickering blue lights of the emergency vehicles. The frantic shouting of orders and the roar of the fire hoses began to subside, and a heavy, suffocating silence fell over Gonesse. It was a silence born of shock. The residents who had gathered at the police cordons stood in a trance-like state, staring at the spot where the pride of the French aviation fleet now lay in pieces. The iconic pointed nose and the elegant delta wings were gone, replaced by a tangled heap of blackened wreckage that was almost unrecognizable. The only sound remaining was the occasional crackle of cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic thud of a helicopter circling above. The smoke, now a lighter gray, drifted slowly toward the horizon, carrying with it the scent of a dream that had ended in fire. By nightfall, the flames were mostly out, leaving behind a smoldering scar on the landscape. The Hotelissimo was no longer a building, but a tomb. In the darkness, the flashlights of investigators began to dance over the ruins, searching for answers in the ash. The town of Gonesse, which had woken up to a bright and ordinary summer day, would never be the same. The silence that night was deep and hollow, filled with the weight of 113 lives lost. As the cooling ruins settled into the earth, the magnitude of what had happened began to settle into the collective consciousness of the world. The investigation was just beginning, but for the people of Gonesse, the story was written in the charred remains of the hotel and the heavy, lingering stillness of the air. The fire was gone, but the shadows it cast would stretch far into the coming years. The morning sun rose over the commune of Gonesse with a heavy, muted light, as if the sky itself was hesitant to look down upon what remained. The frantic energy of the previous night, the wailing sirens, the desperate shouts of the fire crews, and the blinding orange glare of the inferno had given way to a profound and hollow silence. In the gray light of dawn, the site of the Hotelissimo was a landscape of ash and ghosts. Wisps of white smoke still curled lazily from the blackened heaps of rubble, rising into the cool air like fading memories. The scent in the air was thick and complex, a cloying mixture of scorched earth, damp wood, and the sharp, chemical tang of thousands of liters of unburnt kerosene that had soaked into the soil. It was here, amidst the ruins of a quiet roadside hotel, that the men and women of the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety arrived to begin their grim task. These investigators, dressed in white protective suits that stood out sharply against the charcoal-colored debris, moved with a slow, deliberate reverence. To an outsider, the scene was a chaotic jumble of destruction, but to these experts, every twisted piece of metal was a word in a sentence they were desperate to read. They began the process of sifting, a task that required both physical strength and extreme delicacy. They had to distinguish between the mundane and the catastrophic. A crumpled metal frame might have been a guest's chair from the hotel dining room, or it might have been a critical component of the Concorde's complex landing gear. They worked in near silence, the only sounds being the crunch of boots on glass and the occasional metallic clink of a find being placed into a labeled evidence bag. The weight of 113 lives hung over the field, turning the recovery effort into a somber vigil. The primary objective in those first few hours was the recovery of the flight recorders. These so-called black boxes, which are actually painted a vivid, fluorescent orange to aid in their discovery, were buried somewhere within the tangled remains of the aircraft's tail section. Approximately 4 hours after the crash, a technical investigator spotted a glint of orange through the grime. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were pulled from the wreckage, their outer casings scorched by the heat and dented by the violence of the impact. Though they were scarred, they were intact. These two devices held the final 30 minutes of conversation between the crew and the heartbeat of the aircraft's mechanical systems. They were immediately placed under seal and whisked away by police escort to the laboratories, treated with the urgency of a heart transplant, for they contained the only voices left to tell the truth of those 46 seconds of flight. While the recorders were being analyzed in a sterile lab miles away, the team in Gonesse began to look backward. They followed the path of the disaster through the air, tracing it back toward the airport. It became clear that the story did not start at the hotel. As they examined the trail of scorched grass and scattered parts, they found something curious. Far from the main impact site, near the start of the debris field, were fragments of a tire. This was the first breadcrumb in a trail that led all the way back to the concrete of runway 26, right at Charles de Gaulle. The investigators realized that to understand why the great white bird fell from the sky, they had to return to the place where its wheels last touched the earth. The investigation was expanding, moving from the tomb of the hotel back to the very strip of tarmac where the journey had begun. On that runway, under the glare of the afternoon sun, investigators performed a slow, rhythmic sweep of the pavement. They walked shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the ground, looking for anything that did not belong. And then they found it. Lying on the gray concrete was a small, unassuming strip of metal. It was made of a titanium alloy, roughly 44 centimeters long and only a few centimeters wide. It was curved, jagged at one end, and completely foreign to the Concorde. This small piece of hardware, no larger than a ruler, seemed out of place in a world of supersonic engines and complex aerodynamics. Yet, as the sun glinted off its metallic surface, the investigators felt a chill. This was not a piece of the Concorde. It was a visitor from another aircraft, a piece of debris that had been left behind just 5 minutes before the flight took off. The sifting of the ashes had led them to a cold, hard truth. The giant had been brought down by a splinter. As evening descended once more, the investigators began the process of mapping the debris on the runway. Every fragment of rubber, every shard of the fuel tank's skin, and that lone titanium strip were measured and photographed with mathematical precision. The contrast was haunting. On one end of the city, families were beginning to mourn, and the ruins of the Hotelissimo were being guarded by a ring of steel and sorrow. On the other end, in a quiet office, the tapes from the cockpit were being played back for the first time. The crackle of the headsets and the calm, professional voices of the pilots filled the room, oblivious to the fate that was rushing toward them. The investigation was no longer just about moving rubble. It was about reconstructing a tragedy, second by painful second, as the secrets hidden in the ashes began to whisper their first, terrible answers. The runway at Charles de Gaulle is a vast, gray expanse that, under the weight of a summer night, feels almost like a desert. In the hours following the tragedy of July 25, 2000, the usual roar of jet engines was replaced by a heavy, unnatural silence. Investigators moved like ghosts across the tarmac, their flashlights cutting narrow paths through the darkness. They were looking for anything, a bolt, a shard of glass, a fragment of rubber, that might explain why a marvel of engineering had fallen from the sky in such a violent manner. The air was cool, carrying the faint, lingering scent of scorched earth and jet fuel, as they meticulously mapped the debris field, moving inch by agonizing inch through the shadows. It was during this silent vigil that a single, unassuming object caught the eye of an investigator. Lying on the gray concrete of runway 26 right was a narrow strip of metal. It did not look like it belonged to the Concorde's elegant white skin. It was something darker, something alien to the precision of the supersonic jet. As the flashlight beams settled on it, the object gave off a dull, silvery glint. It was approximately 44 centimeters long, which is about the length of a human forearm, and its width varied unevenly between 29 and 34 millimeters. It was thin, only about 1.4 millimeters thick, but it felt remarkably heavy and rigid for its size. This was the first physical clue in a mystery that would soon pull the world's attention away from the wreckage and toward a single piece of discarded hardware. When the investigators carefully lifted the strip, they noticed peculiar details that spoke of a troubled history. It was covered in a crust of red mastic adhesive, a type of epoxy used in aviation, and it was riddled with rivet holes. To a trained eye, these holes were troubling. They had been drilled at irregular intervals, showing a lack of the surgical precision usually required in aircraft maintenance. Forensic analysis soon revealed a critical fact. The strip was made of a titanium alloy, composed of 90% titanium. This was a startling discovery because the parts in that specific area of an aircraft are typically made of much softer materials, like stainless steel or aluminum. Titanium is incredibly strong and unforgiving. It does not bend easily under pressure. Instead, it cuts. The search for the origin of this metal strip led the team to look at the flight logs of every aircraft that had used the runway that afternoon. They discovered that just 5 minutes before the Concorde began its ill-fated takeoff, a Continental Airlines DC-10, operating as Flight 55, had departed for Newark, New Jersey. This massive three-engine jet had thundered down the same path, its engines roaring with the effort of lifting into the sky. When investigators tracked down that specific DC-10 in Houston, Texas, they found exactly what they were looking for. One of its engines was missing a part, a wear strip from the thrust reverser cowl. It was a match. The small, jagged piece of metal on the runway in Paris had fallen from the belly of a completely different airplane, lying in wait like a trap in the high grass. The story of this strip grew even more complex as the forensic inquiry deepened. Records showed that the part had been replaced on July 9, 2000, during a routine check in Houston. A mechanic had fashioned the replacement part by hand. However, instead of using the specified stainless steel, the mechanic had used a scrap piece of titanium. He had not followed the manufacturer's blueprint. The strip was not cut to the correct dimensions, and the holes did not align with the existing rivets on the engine. It was a makeshift repair, a temporary fix that was never meant to endure the violent vibrations and heat of a jet engine in flight. For 16 days, that titanium strip clung to the DC-10, until the moment it finally vibrated loose and tumbled onto the concrete of runway 26 right. Think for a moment about the terrifying precision of chance. If the strip had fallen flat, the Concorde's heavy tires might have simply crushed it into the ground. But the strip did not lie flat. Forensic tests and computer simulations later suggested that it likely came to rest on its edge, standing upright like a razor blade embedded in the tarmac. When the Concorde reached a speed of over 300 kilometers per hour, its number 2 tire struck the titanium edge. The metal did not yield. It sliced through the reinforced rubber of the tire as if it were parchment. The resulting explosion of the tire was so violent that it sent a 4.5-kilogram chunk of rubber flying upward at nearly 500 kilometers per hour, striking the underside of the wing with the force of a cannonball. This single piece of metal became the focal point of the entire inquiry. It was the physical manifestation of what experts call the butterfly effect, a small, seemingly insignificant error in a maintenance hangar thousands of miles away that created a ripple of consequences. A poorly drilled hole, a choice of the wrong metal, and a few minutes of bad timing converged to bring down a giant. As the investigators held the strip in the quiet of the laboratory, the weight of it seemed to grow. It was no longer just a piece of debris. It was the key that unlocked the story of the disaster. The investigation was moving away from the runway now, shifting its gaze toward the paper trails and the hands that had touched that metal, seeking to understand how such a small object could hold so much power over destiny. The investigators worked in a silence that felt heavy with the weight of history. In a cavernous hangar on the outskirts of Paris, the fragments of the great white bird were laid out like a giant, tragic jigsaw puzzle. There is a specific scent to an investigation site, a mixture of cold industrial metal, the lingering ghost of kerosene, and the sharp, clinical smell of cleaning agents. Under the soft hum of overhead fluorescent lights, experts in white coats moved with slow, deliberate precision. They were not just looking for broken parts, they were looking for a story. They were searching for the exact moment the laws of physics turned against the fastest passenger jet in the world. As they examined the remains of the left wing, a terrifyingly complex chain of events began to emerge. It was a sequence of failures so specific and so perfectly timed that it felt less like an accident and more like a cruel trick of fate. To understand the end, They had to look at the microscopic level, where pressure and motion become a dance of destruction. The chain began on the runway, at a speed that would be unimaginable for any ground vehicle. The Concorde was hurtling down the tarmac at nearly 300 kilometers per hour. At this velocity, the world is a blur of gray and white, a roar of air and engine. Then, the left main landing gear found the metal strip, that small, curved piece of titanium alloy left behind by the aircraft that had departed only 5 minutes earlier. It was 435 millimeters of unintended consequence. When the number 2 tire rolled over it, the metal did not just puncture the rubber. It sliced through it with the efficiency of a guillotine. The tire did not simply go flat, it disintegrated. In the space of a heartbeat, the air pressure inside the tire exploded outward, shredding the reinforced rubber into jagged, heavy projectiles. One of these pieces, a massive chunk weighing 4.5 kilograms, was flung upward with incredible violence, traveling at 500 kilometers per hour toward the underside of the wing. When that piece of rubber struck the wing, it did not pierce the metal. To a casual observer, the wing might have looked intact at the moment of impact, but the physics of what happened next were far more subtle and far more devastating. The tire debris hit the skin of fuel tank number 5 with the force of a hammer blow. Inside that tank was a vast reservoir of jet fuel, filled to 94% of its capacity. Because liquids like kerosene are essentially incompressible, they do not absorb energy by squeezing together. Instead, they transmit it. The kinetic energy from the impact was instantly converted into a high-pressure shockwave, a phenomenon known as the hydrodynamic ram effect. Imagine a pool of water when a heavy stone is dropped into it, but contained within a sealed, rigid box. The energy had nowhere to go but through the liquid itself, moving through the fuel at the speed of sound, searching for any way to escape the sudden, violent surge in pressure. This invisible wave of pressure raced through the fuel, pressing against the interior walls of the tank with impossible force. The metal skin of the Concorde's wing was designed to withstand the immense stresses of supersonic flight, the heat of friction, and the weight of tons of fuel. But it was not designed to be pushed from the inside out by a hydraulic hammer. The pressure surge found the weakest points of the tank's structure, the seams and the access panels just ahead of the landing gear bay. In a horrific reversal of normal mechanical failure, the wing did not cave in. It burst outward. The metal began to tear, peeling away as if an invisible hand were ripping a hole from within. A section of the wing's lower skin, roughly 30 centimeters square, was simply blown off the aircraft. In an instant, a massive breach was created, and the fuel that had been the lifeblood of the journey became a torrential leak, pouring onto the runway at a rate of 60 liters every single second. As the fuel cascaded into the slipstream, it formed a thick, vaporized mist trailing behind the accelerating jet. It was a river of fire waiting for a spark. And in the complex machinery of the landing gear bay, that spark was waiting. Whether it was an electrical arc from a severed wire or the intense heat radiating from the engines, the ignition was almost instantaneous. Within less than 1 second of the tank rupturing, the trail of fuel transformed into a terrifying plume of orange flame. The fire was vast, stretching back dozens of meters, a horizontal pillar of heat that began to lick at the rear of the aircraft. The passengers and crew were still on the ground, but the disaster was already fully realized. The fire was not just a visual horror. It was a physical force, changing the very air that the engines needed to breathe. The tragedy was no longer a possibility. It had become an inevitability, written in the physics of pressure and the volatility of kerosene. The final link in this technical chain involved the engines themselves. As the fire roared beneath the wing, the 2 engines on the left side, numbers 1 and 2, were suddenly starved of clean, cool air. Instead, they began to ingest the hot, turbulent gases from the inferno and fragments of the shredded tire. This caused the engines to surge, a violent instability where the internal combustion process is disrupted. The roar of the engines became a series of ragged bangs and stutters. Thrust began to drop away just as the aircraft reached the point of no return. The pilots felt the plane yawing to the left, fighting against the loss of power and the drag of the fire. They were trapped in a machine that was failing them in ways no one had ever predicted. The dominoes had all fallen, one by one, triggered by a single strip of metal, leading to a catastrophe that was now beyond any human control. The investigators, looking at the charred remains years later, could see it all clearly. A tragedy born of the most intricate laws of fluid dynamics and motion. The investigators from the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis walked the length of runway 26 right in the quiet, hollow hours that followed the tragedy. The vast stretch of asphalt was still warm from the day's sun, and the air hung heavy with the cloying, sweet scent of unburnt jet fuel and the acrid tang of charred remains. It was a somber procession, a line of men in high-visibility vests scanning the ground with the intensity of treasure hunters. Their eyes were not searching for the large, obvious fragments of the wreckage that lay miles away, but for the small, overlooked details that so often hide the silent truth of a disaster. It was there, amidst the dark streaks of tire rubber and the gray dust of the runway, that they discovered a curious piece of metal. It was a narrow strip, curved and agonizingly twisted, that did not seem to belong to the graceful, aerodynamic frame of the Concorde. This was the first cold link in a chain of events that would stretch far beyond the borders of France. This strip of metal was roughly 43 centimeters long, approximately the length of a person's forearm. Its width varied slightly, fluctuating between 29 and 34 millimeters, and it was barely over a millimeter thick. Upon closer inspection in the laboratory, it was identified as a titanium alloy, a metal known for its incredible strength and resistance to extreme heat. But on its surface, there were signs of a struggle. One side was coated in a green epoxy primer, and there were dried remnants of a red, rubbery adhesive known as mastic. Most striking of all were the holes drilled into it. They were not the precise, uniform circles one expects from a factory-built aircraft part. They were irregular, spaced unevenly, and showing signs of being fashioned by hand in a moment of haste. This piece of metal had been modified, and those modifications had left it with a serrated, razor-sharp edge. To find where this piece came from, the investigators had to reconstruct the final moments of the runway's life. They examined the logs of every aircraft that had used runway 26 right that afternoon. Only 5 minutes before the Concorde began its fateful roll, another giant of the skies had thundered down the same stretch of pavement. This was Continental Airlines Flight 55, a McDonnell Douglas DC-1030 destined for Newark, New Jersey. It was a routine international flight, carrying hundreds of passengers toward the American coast. The investigators realized that if the strip had fallen from this specific aircraft, the evidence would currently be thousands of miles away, tucked inside a maintenance hangar in Houston, Texas. A request was immediately sent across the Atlantic to secure the plane for an urgent inspection. When the investigation team finally reached the Continental hangar in Houston, they found the aircraft with the registration November 13067. They focused their attention on the number 3 engine, located on the right side of the wide-bodied jet. As they inspected the fan-thrust reverser cowl, they saw exactly what they had feared. There was a glaring gap, a missing section of the wear strip that was supposed to protect the cowl door during operation. The missing section matched the dimensions and the curve of the titanium piece found in Paris perfectly. Even the traces of red mastic left on the engine surface matched the residue on the runway debris. The phantom of the DC-10 was no longer a theory. It was a documented reality. The investigators now had to find out why such a critical component had simply fallen off. The search shifted from the physical metal to the dense paper trail of maintenance logs. They discovered that the aircraft had undergone a heavy maintenance check, known as a C-check, in Tel Aviv just a few weeks prior, in June of the year 2000. However, further work was performed in Houston on July 9th. It was during this time that a mechanic had been tasked with replacing the wear strip on the engine. The original part, as specified by the manufacturer's manual, should have been made of stainless steel. Steel is strong, yet it is softer than titanium, designed to sit harmoniously against the aluminum of the engine cowl. But for reasons that would later become central to a long criminal trial, a strip of titanium was used instead. It was a material substitution that seemed minor at the time, but it carried a weight of consequences no one could have predicted. This substitution was more than just a technical error. It was a fundamental mismatch of physics. Titanium is an incredibly hard and unforgiving material. Because it was so much stiffer than the stainless steel it replaced, it did not sit flush against the engine cowl. The mechanic had allegedly cut the strip from a larger sheet of titanium using hand tools, which explained the jagged, serrated edges and the irregular rivet holes the investigators had seen in Paris. Because the new holes did not line up with the existing attachment points on the engine, new ones had to be drilled, further weakening the structural bond. To bridge the gaps and attempt to hold the stubborn metal in place, an excessive amount of red mastic was applied. It was a patchwork repair, a temporary fix that was never meant to endure the violent vibrations and immense pressures of a jet engine during the peak of takeoff. As the DC-10 sped down the runway at Charles de Gaulle that July afternoon, the vibrations reached a crescendo. The poorly fastened strip, already under immense stress from previous flights, finally surrendered its grip. It tore away from the engine cowl and fluttered to the ground, a silent, silver blade lying in wait on the asphalt. It sat there for exactly 4 minutes and 40 seconds, reflecting the pale light of the afternoon. In the quiet logic of the universe, it was a tiny, insignificant object, weighing only a few ounces. But in the path of a Concorde traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour, it was a trigger for a catastrophe. The shadow of the DC-10 had left behind a ghost on the runway, a remnant of a minor maintenance mistake that was about to collide with the pride of European aviation. Stable finally tore free from its housing. It fluttered to the ground, a curved shard of titanium alloy 16 inches long, coming to rest directly in the path of the supersonic giant that followed. This small, forgotten fragment would eventually find its way into a courtroom in Pontoise, 10 years after the tragedy it helped to ignite. The air in that courtroom felt heavy, as if the decade that had passed since the accident had settled like dust on the wooden benches. It was February 2010 when the legal proceedings finally began, long after the fire had reclaimed the sky over Gonesse. The room was grand, with tall windows that let in a pale, winter light, illuminating the stacks of legal binders that reached toward the ceiling. Every page in those binders represented a life lost, a family broken, and a question that had remained unanswered for far too long. We sit now in those quiet galleries, hearing the rustle of robes and the low murmur of the translators. This was not just a trial about a crash. It was a trial about the very soul of aviation, a battle between a giant American carrier and the pride of French engineering. At the heart of the prosecution's case was that very strip of titanium. The prosecutors argued that the metal piece had been poorly manufactured and improperly installed on a Continental Airlines DC-10 that had departed just 5 minutes before the Concorde. They painted a picture of negligence, where a simple maintenance error set off a catastrophic chain of events. But the defense had a different story to tell. They spoke of the Concorde as a fragile beauty, an aircraft with a known vulnerability that had been ignored for decades. They claimed that the fire had started even before the wheels touched that metal strip, suggesting that the Concorde was a tragedy waiting to happen, regardless of what lay on the runway. The courtroom became a theater of physics and engineering, where experts debated the speed of rubber fragments and the thickness of aluminum skin. They looked at the history of the fleet, searching for patterns in the metal and the rubber, trying to find where the blame truly lay. Among the defendants sat John Taylor, a mechanic who had spent his life working with his hands, now facing the terrifying weight of involuntary manslaughter charges. He was a man from a world of hangars and grease, far from the polished halls of French justice, yet his name was now inextricably linked to the deaths of 113 people. The defense argued that Taylor was being made a scapegoat, the fall guy for a systemic failure. Beside him was his supervisor, Stanley Ford, and several high-ranking French officials, including Henry Perrier, the man who had once headed the Concorde program. The presence of Perrier, an 80-year-old icon of aviation, added a layer of profound sadness to the room. It was as if the creators of the supersonic dream were being called to account for its most nightmarish moment. The defense painted a picture of a man who followed orders, caught in a machine of corporate and national interests that were far larger than any single person could manage. The debate over the Concorde's design was perhaps the most poignant part of the proceedings. For years, there had been reports of tire failures and fuel tank punctures. Over 70 such incidents had occurred throughout its operational life. The court listened to testimony about how the fuel tanks lacked the protective liners that might have prevented a leak of such magnitude. There was a sense of institutional inertia, a feeling that the Concorde was so beloved, so symbolic of progress, that its flaws were treated as eccentricities rather than dangers. The prosecution accused the French civil aviation authorities of failing to enforce the safety changes that could have saved Flight 4590. As the lawyers spoke, the image of the Concorde began to shift. It was no longer just a triumph of technology. It was a delicate vessel, susceptible to the smallest of intruders on its path. The trial moved slowly, mirroring the weight of the evidence being presented, as the court tried to determine if the plane was truly fit for the skies. In December 2010, the first verdict was finally read. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the soft rustle of papers. Continental Airlines was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and ordered to pay a fine of €200,000, along with €1 million in damages to Air France. John Taylor was given a 15-month suspended sentence. It was a landmark ruling that sent shockwaves through the global aviation community. For the first time, a court had assigned criminal blame for a maintenance error that led to a major disaster. Yet the French officials, including Henry Perrier, were acquitted. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and anger. To some, it felt like justice finally served. To others, it felt like a patriotic judgment that protected French interests, while blaming an American company for a failure that was shared by many. The tension in the room was palpable as the lawyers immediately began preparing for the next step. 2 years later, in November 2012, the case returned to the headlines as it reached the appeals court in Versailles. The atmosphere was different now, perhaps more tempered by time. The appeals court took a new view of the tragedy, overturning the criminal convictions against Continental and John Taylor. They ruled that, while there were mistakes and a degree of negligence, they did not rise to the level of criminal misconduct required for a manslaughter conviction. However, the court maintained the civil liability, decreeing that Continental must still pay 70% of the compensation to the victims' families. This decision reflected the true complexity of the accident, a recognition that while the titanium strip was the immediate trigger, the catastrophe was the result of a perfect storm of factors. The legal echoes finally began to fade, leaving behind a legacy of improved runway safety and a deeper understanding of how the smallest details can determine the fate of hundreds. The courtroom doors closed, but the memory of that afternoon in July remained as vivid as ever. The courtroom in Versailles had fallen silent, the echoes of legal arguments fading into the stone walls. But outside those walls, a different kind of silence had already taken hold. It was the heavy, unnatural quiet of a grounded legend. For decades, the sky had belonged to the Concorde, a white streak of optimism that moved faster than the sun itself. But in the wake of that terrible afternoon, in July of the year 2000, the grace of supersonic flight was replaced by the cold stillness of the hangar. Air France moved first, pulling their remaining fleet from the schedules almost immediately. A few weeks later, in August, British Airways followed. The certificate of airworthiness, the very soul of the aircraft's permission to fly, was suspended. Suddenly, the great white birds were no longer messengers of the future. They were massive, beautiful monuments of steel and titanium, trapped on the tarmac, waiting for a verdict that might never come. Inside the massive hangars at Heathrow and Charles de Gaulle, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of jet fuel and the metallic tang of heavy machinery. Engineers, men and women who had dedicated their entire careers to this single, miraculous machine, now worked in the dim light of late nights and early mornings. They weren't just fixing a plane, they were trying to save a dream. The investigation had laid bare a vulnerability that no one had fully grasped until it was too late. To bring the Concorde back, they had to reinvent its very skin. They began a massive project to line the fuel tanks, all 13 of them, with a specialized material known as Kevlar. Imagine the interior of those wings, a labyrinth of ribs and beams, and now, a new layer of protection. These were molded, egg crate-style liners, designed to act like a self-sealing membrane. If a tire were to burst again, if a fragment were to strike the wing, these liners were meant to catch the energy, to pinch shut, and to prevent the torrent of fuel that had doomed Flight 4590. The work was grueling and intimate. Technicians had to crawl into the cramped, dark spaces within the Delta wings, fitting hundreds of custom panels with the precision of a jeweler. But the fuel tanks were only half of the puzzle. The tires themselves, the catalysts of the tragedy, had to be replaced with something near indestructible. Michelin developed a new technology called near-zero growth. These tires were designed to resist the massive centrifugal forces of a supersonic takeoff, engineered so that even if they were cut or punctured, they would not shatter into the heavy, lethal projectiles that had pierced the wing in Paris. The cost of these modifications was staggering. Millions of pounds and euros poured into a fleet that many already considered a relic of a bygone age. Yet, the pride of two nations was at stake. They were determined that the Concorde would not go out in flames, but would return to the heavens on its own terms. By November of the year 2001, the modifications were complete. On the 7th of that month, the Concorde finally roared back to life, its 4 engines screaming with a familiar, thunderous joy as it carried passengers across the Atlantic once more. It was supposed to be a triumphant return, a symbol of resilience. But the world the Concorde returned to was not the same one it had left. Less than 2 months earlier, the events of September 11th had changed the landscape of aviation forever. The towers had fallen, and with them, the appetite for luxury travel plummeted. The air was filled with a new kind of anxiety. Security became tighter, the global economy wavered, and the high-flying executives who once filled the narrow cabin of the Concorde were now staying home or turning to the emerging world of digital connectivity. The speed of the aircraft, once its greatest asset, began to feel like an expensive luxury in a world that was suddenly slowing down. The economic reality began to close in like a fog. While the Concorde was safer than it had ever been, it was also more expensive to maintain. The fleet was aging, and the parts required to keep it supersonic were becoming rarer and more costly to produce. Airbus, the company that had inherited the responsibility for the aircraft's manufacturing legacy, eventually made a difficult decision. They would no longer provide the technical support and spare parts necessary to keep the fleet in the air. Without the backing of the manufacturer, the end was no longer a question of if, but when. In April of the year 2003, Air France and British Airways made a joint announcement that sent a shockwave through the hearts of aviation enthusiasts everywhere. The era of supersonic passenger travel was coming to a close. The white birds would be retired by the end of the year. The dream that had begun in the 1960s, a dream of a world made smaller by speed, was finally reaching its sunset. The final months were a long, emotional farewell. On a crisp day in late October 2003, the last commercial flights touched down at Heathrow, greeted by thousands of people who had gathered just to catch one last glimpse of that iconic, drooping nose. In November, the very last flight took place, returning a Concorde to its birthplace in Bristol. As the engines were cut for the final time, a profound silence settled over the runway, a silence that has lasted to this day. The investigation into Flight 4590 had not just explained a crash, it had signaled the end of an epoch. Today, these magnificent machines sit in museums, their wings forever still, their engines cold. They remain as a reminder of a time when we reached for the stars and moved faster than sound, a testament to the brilliance of human engineering and the fragile, heartbreaking cost of chasing the horizon. The sun has long since set over the fields of Gonesse, and the sky is now a deep, ink-blue velvet. There is a specific kind of stillness that settles over a place that has witnessed the heavy weight of history. For those who stand near the site where the great white bird finally came to rest, the air feels different. It is thick with memory, but also softened by the passage of more than 20 years. The ground, which once bore the scars of fire and the violence of a sudden descent, has been reclaimed by the quiet persistence of nature. Grass grows where the heat once scorched the earth, and the night breeze carries the faint, distant scent of lavender and damp soil. We find ourselves looking up at the stars, the same stars that the passengers of Flight 4590 might have imagined seeing from the windows of their cruise ship, had they reached their destination. In this quiet, we find a space for reflection. 113 lives were claimed in those brief, harrowing seconds. Most of them were travelers from Germany, a group of 96 people who had set out with hearts full of anticipation for a journey across the Atlantic. They were mothers, fathers, and friends, heading toward a dream vacation on the decks of the motor vessel Deutschland. Beside them were the 9 dedicated crew members, led by Captain Christian Marty, a man who loved the wind and the sea as much as he loved the sky. And we must never forget the 4 individuals on the ground, workers at the hotel whose lives were cut short in a place meant for rest and routine. Their names are now etched into a memorial that stands tucked away, a sanctuary of glass and steel that reflects the changing light of the French countryside. Each name represents a world that ended too soon, a story that was interrupted mid-sentence. We speak their names into the silence of the night, honoring the dignity of their memory and the enduring love of the families they left behind. The Concorde itself has moved from the realm of the living sky to the hallowed halls of preservation. Today, these supersonic masterpieces sit in quiet repose in museums across the globe. At the Intrepid Museum in New York, a Concorde gazes out over the Hudson River, its long, elegant nose reflecting the city lights. In the Smithsonian in Virginia and the Museum of Air and Space in Paris, they stand as monuments to a future that arrived early and departed too soon. There is something profoundly moving about the silence of a machine that once roared at twice the speed of sound. You can walk beneath the delta wings and touch the smooth, white skin of the aircraft, feeling the cool metal that once glowed with the heat of friction at the edge of space. The engines are cold now, the cockpits are dark, and the narrow cabins no longer hum with the chatter of the elite. The great white bird has become a museum queen, a symbol of human ambition and the fragile line between triumph and tragedy. But the legacy of Flight 4590 is not just found in museums or monuments. It is woven into the very fabric of modern aviation safety. Because of that day in July of the year 2000, the world of flight became more vigilant. The fuel tanks of the remaining Concorde fleet were lined with protective Kevlar, a shield born from the lessons of loss. The tires were redesigned to be stronger, and the ways in which we inspect the long, concrete ribbons of our runways were changed forever. Automated systems now scan for the smallest piece of debris, searching for the shadows of danger before a single wheel begins to turn. In every safe landing and every routine takeoff, there is a hidden tribute to those who were lost. Their story taught the world that even the most beautiful dreams require the most rigorous protection. The sky is safer now, watched over by the lessons of a tragedy that refused to be forgotten. As we linger here in the quiet of this final chapter, we listen to the soft rhythm of the night. The distant hum of the modern world continues, but here, in the shadows of Gonesse, there is a profound peace. The investigations are over. The legal battles have settled into the dust of archives. What remains is the enduring image of a slender white aircraft rising into the sun, a vision of grace that once defined an era. We remember the fire, yes, but we also remember the light. We remember the families who found the strength to carry on, and the town that opened its arms to hold the weight of a world's grief. The stars above remain constant, watching over the fields where the Concorde's shadow last fell. The story has found its final resting place among the legends of the sky and the memories of the earth. The journey has reached its end. The path through the clouds and the fire has led us back to the ground, back to the safety of the present moment. The story of the great white bird is now a part of the wind and the stars. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.